The cold steel of a customized Colt 1911 pressed flat against the mahogany desk, but Celeste's eyes were locked on the man who put it there. Declan Gallagher, the most ruthless syndicate leader in Chicago, stared at her trembling, swollen silhouette. "Tell me who the father is," the Mafia boss demanded, his voice a lethal, vibrating whisper that sucked the oxygen from the room. She'd hidden the truth for 6 agonizing months, but time had just run out. Celeste Higgins had spent her entire 32 years mastering the art of invisibility. It was a survival mechanism, one largely afforded to her by her physical size. In a world that worshipped sharp angles, hollowed cheeks, and women who looked like they could snap in a stiff breeze, Celeste was undeniably, unapologetically fat. She had broad, soft shoulders, thick thighs, and a heavy, rounded stomach that she typically draped in oversized cashmere cardigans and loose empire waist dresses. Society had a habit of looking right through women her size, treating them as part of the background scenery. For most of her life, Celeste had resented that invisibility. But for the last 6 months, it had been her greatest weapon. She worked as the senior forensic accountant for Gallagher Logistics, a towering glass and steel corporation situated in the wealthy enclave of Chicago's River North. On paper, it was a legitimate import-export empire. In reality, it was the meticulously clean front for the Gallagher crime syndicate. Celeste knew exactly who she worked for. She saw the millions of dollars moving through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, the sudden spikes in revenue that coincided with shipments at the port of Chicago, and the consulting fees paid out to ghost entities. But Celeste kept her head down, her practical leather clerks silent on the marble floors, and her mouth strictly shut. Her invisibility had worked flawlessly until the night of the winter gala at the Drake Hotel. It was supposed to be a standard corporate obligation. Celeste had worn a deep burgundy velvet gown, one of the few garments she owned that actually hugged her lush curves rather than obscuring them, and found a quiet corner in the Gold Coast room to sip her ginger ale. She hadn't intended to cross paths with Declan Gallagher. Declan was a phantom to most of the employees, a terrifying spectre of a man who ruled his empire with cold, calculated brutality. He was tall, built like a heavyweight boxer, with piercing, pale blue eyes and a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. He was typically surrounded by towering bodyguards, and women poured into 6-inch Christian Louboutins. But that night, Declan had been bleeding. Celeste had retreated to the darkened archival library on the 2nd floor to escape the noise, only to find the Mafia boss slumped against a leather Chesterfield sofa, gripping his ribs, blood seeping through his tailored Tom Ford tuxedo. A rival faction had attempted a quiet hit in the valet tunnel. His security had neutralized the threat, but not before a stray blade caught him. Instead of screaming, Celeste had locked the heavy oak doors. She hadn't panicked. Using the first aid kit from the catering kitchen and her own torn velvet slip, she had cleaned and bound the wound with the clinical precision of a woman who had spent her life quietly fixing other people's messes. Declan had watched her the entire time. He hadn't seen a fat, invisible accountant. Through the haze of pain and adrenaline, he had seen a fiercely competent, deeply grounded woman. When her soft, warm hands had pressed the bandages to his torso, something volatile had ignited between them. The isolation of the room, the scent of her vanilla perfume, the stark contrast of his violent world colliding with her soft, nurturing reality. It had broken down his defenses. And, to Celeste's eternal shock, it had broken down hers. What happened on that leather sofa was desperate, raw, and earth-shattering. Declan had touched her with a reverence she had never experienced, his large hands mapping the heavy curves of her hips and the soft expanse of her belly, as if she were the most exquisite treasure he had ever claimed. For one night, Celeste wasn't invisible. She was the center of a dangerous man's universe. But when the dawn broke over Lake Michigan, reality had crashed back down. Declan's security team had breached the room, sweeping him away to a private underground clinic. Celeste had smoothed her ruined dress, walked out into the freezing Chicago morning, and convinced herself it was a fever dream. Declan was a king of the underworld. She was a plus-size bookkeeper with a penchant for Excel spreadsheets. They were an anomaly, a mistake. 2 months later, the nausea had started. Celeste had sat on the cold tile of her cramped bathroom in Logan Square, staring at the 2 pink lines on the plastic stick, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was pregnant, with the heir to the Gallagher syndicate. Panic had set in instantly. She knew what happened to women who got entangled with the mob. They became leverage. They became targets. And more terrifyingly, she knew what Declan would do if he found out. A man like him wouldn't let his bloodline walk away. He would take the child, and Celeste would be trapped in a gilded cage for the rest of her life. Or worse, deemed an unsuitable mother, and discarded entirely. So she hid it. Her body type played perfectly into her deception. As the baby grew, Celeste simply bought larger cardigans. When her face grew a little fuller, her co-workers assumed she was just gaining weight, a topic no one dared bring up to a fat woman out of sheer social awkwardness. She blamed her morning sickness on a lingering stomach ulcer. She scheduled her appointments at Northwestern Memorial Hospital under a false surname, paying in cash she had meticulously saved. She thought she was safe. She thought she could quietly transfer to a branch in Seattle by her 3rd trimester and disappear into the rain. She hadn't counted on the karma of the Gallagher organization coming back to bite her, and she certainly hadn't counted on Ryan Mitchell. By month 6, the physical toll of the pregnancy was becoming impossible to ignore. Celeste's ankles swelled fiercely by mid-afternoon, suffering from severe edema that made her sensible shoes feel like vice grips. The baby, a boy, the ultrasound tech had cheerfully announced, was incredibly active, constantly kicking against her ribs. Her lower back ached with a persistent, grinding pain, and the heavy wool coats she wore to obscure her growing midsection in the warming spring weather were making her dizzy with heat. Celeste was exhausted, operating on a knife's edge of anxiety. She was fast-tracking her transfer, quietly packing up her apartment, and finalizing the Q2 audits. That was when she found the discrepancies in Ryan's accounts. Ryan Mitchell was a mid-level manager who handled the logistics for the Gallagher's South Side distribution hubs. He was a slick, overly cologned man who wore suits that were slightly too shiny and smiled with too many teeth. He had always treated Celeste with a thinly veiled disgust, making passive-aggressive comments about her diet or sighing loudly when he had to squeeze past her in the break room. Celeste had never liked him, but as she ran the numbers on the May shipments, her dislike crystallized into cold, professional dread. Ryan was skimming. He was inflating the cost of shipping containers and pocketing the difference, nearly $200,000 over 4 months. In the Gallagher organization, stealing from Declan wasn't a forcible offense, it was a fatal one. Celeste compiled the evidence on a secure flash drive, intending to drop it anonymously in the compliance lockbox. She wanted no part in the violent retribution that would undoubtedly follow. But before she could make the drop, her body betrayed her. It happened on a Tuesday. Celeste had been experiencing a bout of round ligament pain, so sharp it brought tears to her eyes. She had left the office early, taking a cab directly to the maternity ward at Northwestern. She hadn't noticed the black Mercedes trailing her. Ryan had been paranoid for weeks, knowing the auditors were crawling over his quarterly reports. He had been looking for leverage, any dirt he could find on the accounting team, to blackmail them into looking the other way. When he saw Celeste, the straight-laced, boring senior accountant, sneaking into the obstetrics wing, he thought he had struck gold. The next morning, Ryan cornered Celeste in the basement archives of the Gallagher building. The air down there was stale, smelling of ozone and old paper. Well, well, well. Celeste Higgins, Ryan purred, stepping out from behind a row of filing cabinets. He blocked her path to the elevator, his eyes dropping to her heavy, draped torso. "You've been keeping secrets." Celeste stiffened, clutching a stack of ledgers to her chest. Her heart began a frantic, terrified drumbeat. "Move out of my way, Ryan. I saw you yesterday," he said, taking a step closer. His gaze was predatory, gleaming with malicious triumph. "Maternity ward, under the name Celeste Hughes. You're knocked up. Who's the unlucky guy? Does he know his kid is being carried by the office whale?" Celeste's face burned with a mixture of humiliation and sheer panic, but she forced her expression to remain stoic. "My personal life is none of your business. Let me pass." "It becomes my business when I need a favor," Ryan sneered, his tone dropping the false pleasantry. He reached out, tapping a manicured finger against the files she held. "I know you're looking at the Southside accounts. I need you to adjust the margins, make the discrepancies vanish." "You want me to cover up your theft?" Celeste asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Ryan, Declan will kill you if he finds out." "Declan won't find out unless you tell him," Ryan hissed, leaning in so close she could smell the stale coffee and mints on his breath. "But if you don't fix those books by Friday, I'm going straight to HR. Actually, no, I'll go to the gossip mill. How long do you think you can keep your job here once everyone knows you're an unwed, pregnant liability? They'll find an excuse to fire you. Good luck paying for that bastard child without the Gallagher health insurance." Ryan thought he was being clever. He thought she was just a pathetic, lonely woman hiding a shameful secret from a random one-night stand. He had absolutely no idea that the baby he was threatening belonged to the apex predator of their world. "Friday, Celeste," Ryan whispered, stepping aside to let her pass. "Or the whole building knows." Celeste practically ran to the elevator, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The baby kicked violently in response to her spiking adrenaline. If Ryan exposed her pregnancy, the scrutiny on her would multiply 100-fold. People would start doing the math. They would start looking closer. And worse, if Declan's inner circle found out Ryan was trying to blackmail an employee, Declan would intervene personally. And Declan was already back in Chicago. He had returned from a brutal 3-month turf war in Palermo, Italy, looking leaner, darker, and more dangerous than ever. And since the moment his private jet had touched down at O'Hare, he had been looking for her. Celeste had felt his eyes on her in the lobby. She had seen his imposing silhouette lingering near the glass walls of the accounting department. Declan hadn't forgotten the night at the Drake. If anything, the memory of her soft skin and quiet strength had haunted him across the Atlantic. He had tried to dismiss it, to bury it under the blood and violence of his daily life. But it was impossible. He wanted her back in his bed. He wanted to strip away the oversized sweaters and possess the woman beneath them. He didn't know she was carrying his child, but his lethal instincts were already pinging. He noticed how she avoided his gaze. He noticed the slight waddle in her usually brisk walk. He noticed the pale, exhausted sheen of her skin. The tension was a tightly coiled spring, winding tighter with every passing hour. Celeste was trapped between a blackmailer who wanted her to commit corporate suicide and a mafia boss whose obsession with her was rapidly breaking through his ironclad control. By Thursday afternoon, the walls had completely closed in. Celeste had tried to bury Ryan's missing funds in a dummy account to buy herself time, but her hands had shaken so badly she had nearly locked herself out of the mainframe. Her stress levels were dangerously high. Her blood pressure was spiking, causing a dull, throbbing headache behind her eyes. She needed to get out. She had booked a one-way flight to Seattle for that night. Her bags were in the trunk of her Honda Civic, parked in the lowest level of the Gallagher Building's underground garage. She just had to make it to 5 p.m. At 4:45 p.m., the accounting floor was nearly empty. Celeste grabbed her heavy wool coat, draping it over her swelling stomach, and headed for the service elevator. She was panting slightly, the weight of the child pressing heavily on her lungs. She made it to sub-level 3. The garage was dimly lit, echoing with the distant hum of ventilation fans. She fumbled for her keys, her swollen fingers slipping on the metal. "Going somewhere, Celeste?" Celeste spun around, her heart dropping into her stomach. Ryan Mitchell stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. He looked frantic, his tie loosened, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "It's Thursday, Ryan." "You said Friday," Celeste said, backing up until her spine hit the cold metal of her car door. "The internal audit team just pulled the South Side manifests," Ryan snapped, closing the distance between them. "You didn't fix the books. They're going to see the missing funds." "I couldn't," Celeste cried out, her protective instinct flaring as she crossed her arms over her abdomen. "The system is double encrypted. If I alter the main ledger, it flags Declan directly. I'd be signing my own death warrant." "You stupid fat cow," Ryan snarled, his panic turning to vicious rage. He lunged forward, grabbing Celeste by the shoulders and slamming her hard against the car. Celeste screamed, a raw, primal sound of terror. She didn't care about the pain in her shoulders. She only cared about the impact to her stomach. "Let go of me. You're going to march back upstairs and fix it right now, or I swear to God I'll beat the living." Ryan's threat was abruptly cut off by a sickening crunch. Celeste gasped as Ryan's weight was violently ripped away from her. She slumped against her car, clutching her stomach, gasping for air. Standing over Ryan's crumpled, groaning body was Tommy, Declan Gallagher's 6'4" head of security. Tommy's knuckles were bleeding, his face a mask of terrifying indifference. He didn't even look at Ryan. He looked directly at Celeste. "Mr. Gallagher wants to see you in the penthouse." "Now," Tommy said, his voice a low gravel. I need to go home," Celeste stammered, tears of shock blurring her vision. "Please, Tommy. I'm not feeling well." Tommy finally glanced at her stomach, his eyes narrowing slightly before returning to her face. "It wasn't a request, Ms. Higgins. Come with me." There was no escaping. The hard karma Ryan had invited had arrived instantly, but Celeste was caught in the blast radius. Trembling uncontrollably, she allowed Tommy to escort her to the private executive elevator. The ride up to the 60th floor felt like a descent into hell. Every floor they passed was another nail in her coffin. The doors opened directly into Declan's penthouse office. It was a massive, intimidating space of dark wood, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, and leather furniture. Declan was standing by the window, pouring a glass of amber whiskey. He didn't turn around when she entered. Tommy closed the doors silently behind her, leaving them alone. The silence stretched, suffocating and heavy. Celeste stood near the door, her heavy wool coat still clutched tightly around her. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving, the baby thrashing in distress inside her. "Ryan Mitchell has been skimming from my South Side hubs," Declan said softly, his deep voice vibrating through the room. He took a sip of his whiskey. "My auditors brought it to my attention an hour ago. Tell me, Celeste, why was my senior forensic accountant down in the parking garage, being assaulted by a dead man walking?" Celeste swallowed hard. He knew I found the discrepancies. He wanted me to hide them." Declan finally turned around. The raw, predatory intensity in his eyes made Celeste take a step back. He set his glass down on his mahogany desk. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his suit jacket, drew his customized Colt 1911, and set it flat on the wood. The click of the metal echoed like a gunshot. "I have men who will spend the next 3 days explaining to Ryan exactly why stealing from me is a mistake," Declan said, walking slowly around the desk toward her. "But you are a puzzle, Celeste. You're smart, you're cautious. You wouldn't risk your life for a worm like Ryan, which means he had leverage on you." He was standing inches from her now. Celeste had to tilt her head back to look at him. His scent, sandalwood, expensive tobacco, and pure concentrated danger enveloped her. "What leverage did he have, Celeste?" Declan asked, his voice dropping to a hypnotic, dangerous murmur. "Nothing," Celeste lied, a tear finally escaping and tracking down her pale cheek. "He had nothing." Declan's eyes darkened. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently tracing the line of her jaw. Celeste shivered violently. "You're shaking," he noted. His gaze swept over her. "You look exhausted. Your skin is pale, and you're wearing a thick wool coat indoors in 70-degree weather." Celeste squeezed her eyes shut. "Please, no. Please don't look." But Declan was no fool. He was a man who survived by noticing the smallest, most hidden details. His hand trailed down from her jaw, over her collarbone, and stopped at the lapels of her heavy coat. With a swift, decisive movement, he pulled the coat open. Underneath, Celeste was wearing a thin maternity blouse that clung to the undeniable, perfectly round, 6-month swell of her stomach. The silence that followed was absolute. Declan stared at her abdomen, frozen. For the first time since Celeste had met him, the Mafia boss looked completely, utterly shocked. His eyes flicked back up to her face, then back down to her stomach. His mind, brilliant and ruthless, did the math in a fraction of a second. 6 months. The gala at the Drake. His breathing hitched. The mask of cold control shattered, replaced by something wooled, possessive, and terrifyingly furious. "Tell me who the father is," the Mafia boss demanded, his voice a lethal, vibrating whisper that sucked the oxygen from the room. She'd hidden the truth for 6 agonizing months, but time had just run out. Celeste sobbed, her hands coming up to cradle her belly in a desperate, protective gesture. "Declan, please." "Say it," he commanded, closing the final inch between them, his hands gripping her shoulders, not tight enough to hurt, but firm enough to trap her. His eyes were burning with a terrifying fire. "Say it, Celeste." "He's yours," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's yours." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. "He's yours." For a man who had built an empire on anticipation, strategy, and cold calculation, Declan Gallagher looked entirely unmoored. His gaze remained locked on Celeste's face, his pale blue eyes searching her terrified features for a lie, a trick, any sign of deceit. But there was none. Only the raw, trembling exhaustion of a woman who had carried a monumental secret entirely on her own. Slowly, as if approaching a skittish deer, Declan moved his hands from her shoulders. He let them trail down the soft, heavy wool of her coat, pushing the fabric aside completely to reveal the full truth. His large, scarred palms hovered for a fraction of a second before he gently, almost reverently, placed them flat against the swell of her stomach. Celeste held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. At the exact moment his hands made contact, the baby, agitated by Celeste's spiking adrenaline and elevated heart rate, delivered a sharp, rolling kick right against Declan's palm. Declan gasped. It was a sharp, inhaled breath that sounded almost painful. The ruthless syndicate leader, a man who had ordered the demise of rivals without blinking, stumbled back half a step, staring at his own hand as if he had just been struck by lightning. "A boy," Celeste whispered, fresh tears spilling over her lashes. "The ultrasound. They said it's a boy." A terrifyingly beautiful darkness washed over Declan's face. The shock evaporated, instantly replaced by a possessiveness so intense it seemed to change the atmospheric pressure of the room. He looked at Celeste, not just as a woman he desired, but as the mother of his bloodline, the sacred vessel carrying the next generation of his empire. Before he could speak, the heavy oak doors of the penthouse opened. Tommy stepped in, his expression grim. In his massive hands, he carried Celeste's rolling suitcase and a canvas duffel bag. "Found these in the trunk of her Civic, boss," Tommy reported, setting the luggage on the floor with a heavy thud. "Along with a printed boarding pass, one way to Seattle. Flight leaves in 3 hours. Declan's head snapped toward the luggage, and then back to Celeste. The warmth that had just blossomed in his eyes instantly froze into glacial fury. "Seattle," Declan repeated, the word dripping with a lethal, quiet menace. "You were leaving. You were going to take my son across the country and disappear." "I had to," Celeste cried out, her protective instincts overriding her fear. She wrapped her arms around her belly, stepping back from him. "Look at what happened today, Declan. Ryan figured it out just by seeing me at the hospital. If he knew, others would know. Do you have any idea what they would do to me? I'm not a mob wife. I'm a fat, invisible accountant. I would be leverage. I would be a target. And if you found out..." She choked on a sob. "I thought you would take him from me. I thought you would lock me away or discard me because I don't fit into your world." "Discard you?" Declan growled, closing the distance between them in 2 massive strides. He grabbed her forearms, his grip firm but careful not to bruise. "You think I would throw away the woman who saved my life? The woman carrying my heir? You think I care about the superficial garbage of fitting in?" "Declan, please. You are never leaving, Celeste," he stated, his voice a low, immovable absolute. "You are never getting on a plane without me. You are never hiding in the shadows again. Do you understand me?" The sheer magnitude of the stress, the confrontation with Ryan, the terror of being caught, the absolute surrender of her secret, finally caught up with Celeste's overburdened body. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. The roaring in her ears grew deafening. Her knees buckled under the weight of her heavy frame. "Celeste!" Declan shouted, catching her instantly. He scooped her into his arms, easily supporting her lush curves and the added weight of the pregnancy. He carried her to the leather Chesterfield sofa, a bitter, poetic echo of the night they had met. and laid her down gently. "Tommy!" Declan roared over his shoulder. "Get Harrison here, now! Tell him if he isn't in this penthouse in 10 minutes, I'll burn his clinic to the ground." "Already on it," Tommy said, his phone already pressed to his ear. Declan knelt beside the sofa, his large hands frantically checking Celeste's pulse. She was pale, her breathing shallow, but she was conscious. She looked up at him, her eyes glassy. "Ryan," Celeste breathed out, her mind snagging on the immediate danger. "The books. The audit." "Do not think about Ryan Mitchell," Declan said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "Ryan put his hands on you. He shoved the mother of my child against a concrete pillar in a cold garage." Celeste saw a flash of pure, unadulterated violence in Declan's eyes, a promise of retribution so absolute it made her shiver. The hard karma Ryan had invoked by trying to bully the invisible fat girl in the office had manifested into the worst possible nightmare. He hadn't just bullied an accountant, he had assaulted the queen of the Gallagher syndicate. "Tommy," Declan said, not taking his eyes off Celeste's pale face. "Yeah, boss. Take Ryan to the warehouse at the docks, the one with the soundproofing," Declan ordered softly. "Make sure he is wide awake when I get him there. He likes to steal. We'll see how well he steals when he doesn't have fingers." Celeste closed her eyes, turning her face into the soft leather cushions. She had tried to avoid the violence of Declan's world. She had tried to remain invisible, but the veil was gone. She was bathed in the harsh, bloody light of the Mafia, and there was no going back. When Celeste next opened her eyes, the ceiling was wrong. It wasn't the water-stained plaster of her Logan Square apartment, nor was it the sleek, modern acoustic tiles of the Gallagher corporate building. It was a soaring, vaulted ceiling adorned with hand-carved mahogany beams and a cascading crystal chandelier. She was lying in a massive four-poster bed, fitted with sheets, so soft they felt like liquid silk against her skin. The room smelled of lavender and sandalwood. Blood pressure is returning to normal, but her heart rate is still elevated, a calm, clinical voice said from somewhere to her left. Celeste turned her head heavily. Standing near the edge of the bed was an older man with silver hair and a stethoscope draped around his neck. Next to him, arms crossed over his broad chest, stood Declan. He had shed his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink of syndicate tattoos winding up his forearms. He looked exhausted, yet violently alert. "Celeste." Declan stepped forward immediately, his hard face softening the moment her eyes met his. He sat on the edge of the mattress, the bed dipping under his considerable weight. "How do you feel?" "Like I was hit by a truck," she croaked. Her mouth felt like it was stuffed with cotton. Dr. Harrison stepped forward, offering her a glass of ice water with a straw. "You experienced a severe vasovagal syncope episode, Ms. Higgins, brought on by extreme stress, exhaustion, and the physical demands of your 3rd trimester. The baby is perfectly fine. Heartbeat is strong and steady. But you, my dear, are dangerously close to preeclampsia. You need bed rest, hydration, and 0 stress." "Thank you, Harrison." "You can wait outside," Declan commanded, not taking his eyes off Celeste. The doctor nodded wisely, packing his bag and slipping out of the heavy double doors, leaving them in a profound, heavy silence. Celeste took a slow sip of the water, looking around the palatial bedroom. "Where am I?" "My home, in Vinatarka," Declan said. "Your apartment is being packed up by my team as we speak. Your lease is broken. You live here now." It wasn't a request. The gilded cage had locked its doors. Celeste felt a flare of her old defensive anger, a survival trait she had honed over years of being marginalized. "You can't just kidnap me, Declan," she said, trying to sit up. Her heavy breasts heaved with the effort, and her swollen stomach made the movement clumsy. Declan immediately put a hand behind her back, effortlessly assisting her until she was propped against the plush pillows. "I'm not kidnapping you, Celeste. I am protecting you," Declan corrected softly. "From the moment Tommy brought you upstairs, your life changed permanently. The men in my organization respect strength, but they look for weakness. If anyone had found out you were carrying my child before I did, they would have used you to bleed me dry." Celeste looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of the silk blanket. "That's exactly why I didn't tell you. That and—" She swallowed the lump in her throat. "I know how men like you operate. I know the women you usually surround yourself with. They are runway models. They are flawless. I am—" She gestured vaguely to her broad, soft body. "I am fat, Declan. I've been fat my whole life. People look right through me. I assumed that night at the Drake was just a trauma bond. A mistake. I thought if I told you about the baby, you'd take him and pay me off to disappear, because I'm an embarrassment." Declan's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle feathered near his ear. He moved closer, caging her between his arms as he leaned over her. "Look at me," he commanded. Celeste hesitated, then lifted her chin, meeting his fierce blue gaze. "The women you're talking about are decorations," Declan said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in his chest. "They are status symbols, nothing more. They shatter at the first sign of blood. But you? I was bleeding out on a couch and you didn't scream. You locked the door and put me back together. You are brilliant. You are strong. And as for your body—" He moved his hand, letting his large palm slide over the heavy curve of her hip beneath the blankets, trailing up to rest possessively on the side of her waist. "I have thought about the softness of your skin, the weight of your curves, every single night for the last 6 months," he confessed, his voice turning ragged with restrained desire. "You are exactly the woman I want. Do not ever insult the mother of my child by calling her an embarrassment again. You are a queen, Celeste, my queen." The absolute sincerity in his eyes shattered the defensive walls Celeste had spent 32 years building. For the first time in her life, a man wasn't looking past her or settling for her. He was looking at her as if she were the only woman on earth. A tear slipped down her cheek, and Declan caught it with his thumb. "Now," Declan said, his tone shifting back to business, though his hand remained gently stroking her side. "We have a problem to solve. Ryan Mitchell." Celeste shivered at the name. Did you kill him?" "Not yet," Declan said coolly. "He's in a holding cell at my docks. My auditors have been trying to untangle the mess he made in the Southside accounts. But they are terrified of making a mistake. They say the encryption is layered with dummy corpse." Celeste's professional brain engaged, pushing aside the fear. She was the senior forensic accountant. This was her domain. "They're looking at the wrong layer," Celeste said, her voice steadying. "Ryan wasn't smart enough to build a new encryption. He piggybacked off the old bootlegging routes your grandfather used, filtering the money through the offshore shell company tied to the Maritime Shipping Union." Declan stared at her, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He looked thoroughly, incredibly impressed. "You tracked it back to the Union?" "I tracked it all," Celeste said, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "Give me a laptop. I can isolate the missing funds and rebuild the ledger in 2 hours." Declan laughed, a deep, booming sound that echoed in the vast bedroom. It was a sound of pure triumph. He leaned forward, pressing a hard, claiming kiss to her forehead. "You," he murmured against her skin, "are the most dangerous thing in my empire." Within 10 minutes, a top-of-the-line encrypted laptop was placed on a velvet breakfast tray over Celeste's lap. Propped up against the pillows, wearing one of Declan's oversized black silk shirts that draped beautifully over her pregnant belly, Celeste went to work. Her fingers flew across the keys, her mind sharply navigating the complex financial labyrinth of the Gallagher syndicate. Declan sat in an armchair by the window, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching her. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched the capable, intelligent woman who had hidden in plain sight, who had nearly outsmarted him, now actively dismantling the man who had dared to threaten her. 2 hours later, Celeste hit the enter key with a satisfying click. "Done," she announced, leaning back with a sigh. "The funds are isolated. The ledger is clean. Ryan's digital footprint is completely exposed." Declan stood up, walking over to the bed. He looked at the screen, then looked at Celeste. The pride in his eyes was undeniable. "Thank you, Mhioil," he said, using the Gaelic term of endearment softly. He closed the laptop and set it aside. "Get some sleep. You and our son need to rest." "Where are you going?" Celeste asked, her heart giving a little flutter as he strapped a leather shoulder holster over his chest. Declan's eyes went dead and cold, the syndicate boss returning in full force. "Ryan Mitchell thought he could threaten what is mine," Declan said, his voice carrying the chilling finality of a judge passing a death sentence. "I'm going to the docks. It's time I show him what happens when karma hits back." The Southside docks were a desolate stretch of rusted shipping containers, cracked concrete, and freezing water that sloshed relentlessly against the pylons. In the dead of night, the area was swallowed by an impenetrable fog, rolling off Lake Michigan. Warehouse 4 was positioned at the very edge of the pier. From the outside, it was a decaying relic of Chicago's industrial past. On the inside, it was a soundproofed, meticulously clean interrogation room where the Gallagher syndicate ensured their secrets stayed buried. Inside, the air was thick with the metallic tang of fear and the harsh glare of industrial halogen lights. In the center of the vast, empty concrete floor sat a single, heavy iron chair, bolted to the ground. Ryan Mitchell was strapped to it. His shiny, expensive suit was ruined, torn at the shoulders and stained with sweat and grime. His face was bruised from where Tommy had intercepted him in the parking garage, and his breath came in short, panicked gasps. He had been sitting in the freezing warehouse for 3 hours, surrounded by 4 of Declan Gallagher's most terrifying enforcers. None of them had spoken a single word to him. They just stood in the shadows, like gargoyles, waiting. The silence was a psychological torture all its own. Ryan's mind raced frantically, trying to calculate his odds. He was arrogant, but he wasn't entirely stupid. He knew he had been caught stealing, but he also knew the syndicate's hierarchy. Mid-level managers who skimmed were usually beaten within an inch of their lives, stripped of their assets, and exiled. He could survive that. He just had to grovel, return the money, and blame it on an accounting error. He would blame Celeste. Yes, that was the play. He would tell Declan that the fat, incompetent bookkeeper had bungled the ledgers and tried to frame him. The heavy steel door at the far end of the warehouse groaned open. The rhythmic, heavy footfalls of leather dress shoes echoed against the concrete walls. The enforcers immediately straightened, stepping back into the shadows to clear a path. Declan Gallagher emerged into the harsh pool of halogen light. He had changed out of his suit and was wearing a black cashmere turtleneck and dark slacks, looking every inch the apex predator of the Chicago underworld. His face was an emotionless mask, carved from granite. In his right hand, he held a thick manila folder. "Mr. Gallagher! Declan, please, you have to listen to me!" Ryan screamed, his voice cracking as he strained against the heavy zip ties binding his wrists to the armrests. "It's a misunderstanding. I can explain everything. The numbers." Declan didn't say a word. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he was standing just inches from Ryan. He tossed the manila folder onto Ryan's lap. The pages spilled out, printed copies of the exact ledger Celeste had rebuilt from the penthouse bed just hours prior. "The offshore shell company tied to the Maritime Shipping Union," Declan said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate in Ryan's very bones. 4 months, $214,000, neatly itemized and scrubbed of your digital footprint, or so you thought. Ryan stared at the papers, the blood draining completely from his face. His lie withered in his throat. How did you find that?" "My senior forensic accountant found it," Declan replied, his pale blue eyes locking onto Ryan's terrified gaze. "She isolated the missing funds and rebuilt the ledger in under 2 hours. She is exceptionally brilliant." Ryan's desperation surged, overriding his common sense. "Celeste, boss, you have to believe me. She's setting me up. She's a crazy, lonely woman. I caught her trying to sneak out of the building. She's pregnant, for God's sake. Probably trying to steal the money to run away and take care of whatever bastard she's carrying." The temperature in the warehouse seemed to plummet 30 degrees. The 4 enforcers in the shadows physically recoiled, taking a collective step back from their boss. Declan slowly leaned down, placing a hand on each of the iron armrests, trapping Ryan in his terrifying orbit. "Let me tell you exactly what you did today, Ryan," Declan whispered, the quietness of his voice far more horrifying than a scream. "You cornered my senior accountant. You threatened to expose a private medical condition to destroy her career. And then, when she refused to become an accomplice to your theft, you put your hands on her. You shoved her against a concrete pillar. I was angry," Ryan stammered, sobbing openly now. "I didn't hurt her." "You shoved a pregnant woman," Declan continued, his voice dropping into a demonic register. "A woman carrying a child. Did you know she was 6 months along? Did you know she was exhausted, suffering from hypertension, and terrified?" "She's just a bookkeeper," Ryan cried, completely failing to understand the magnitude of his error. "She's nobody." Declan's hand shot out, his massive fingers wrapping around Ryan's throat with the speed of a striking viper. He didn't squeeze enough to crush the windpipe, just enough to cut off the air supply and lift Ryan's chin, so they were eye to eye. "She is the mother of my son," Declan snarled, the absolute truth detonating in the silent warehouse. Ryan's eyes widened to impossible proportions, the whites stark against his bruised skin. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He hadn't just bullied an invisible, overweight office worker. He had blackmailed, threatened, and physically assaulted the woman carrying the heir to the Gallagher syndicate. He had touched the boss's queen. "Please," Ryan choked out, tears streaming down his face, a wet stain spreading across the front of his trousers as his bladder let go in sheer terror. "I didn't know. Boss, I swear to God, I didn't know." "Ignorance does not grant you amnesty," Declan said coldly, releasing Ryan's throat. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his hand, staring at the pathetic, weeping man with utter disgust. "You thought she was weak because of how she looks," Declan said, turning his back on Ryan and walking towards the shadows. "You looked at her soft curves, her quiet demeanor, and you saw a victim. You saw someone you could crush without consequence. You failed to realize that she possesses more strength in her little finger than you have in your entire miserable existence. She survived me. She survived the shadows. And she systematically dismantled your little operation from my bed." Declan stopped at the edge of the light. He looked over at Tommy, who was standing by a heavy metal workbench, covered in various tools. "I told Celeste you liked to steal," Declan said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "I told her we would see how well you steal without your fingers. But she has a soft heart. She doesn't like unnecessary bloodshed." Ryan gasped, a flicker of desperate hope igniting in his chest. "Thank you. Thank her. Please." "So," Declan continued, ignoring the interruption, "I will compromise. Tommy." "Yes, boss." Tommy stepped forward, picking up a heavy, steel-headed sledgehammer from the workbench. "Mr. Mitchell is permanently relieved of his position at Gallagher Logistics. He is also permanently relieved of his ability to ever type on a keyboard or hold a pen," Declan ordered, his face a mask of absolute cruelty. "Shatter every bone in his hands, both of them. Then put him on a freighter bound for Jakarta. If he ever steps foot on American soil again, I won't be so merciful." Ryan began to scream, thrashing wildly against the heavy zip ties, begging and pleading as Tommy approached with the hammer. Declan didn't stay to watch. He turned and walked out the heavy steel doors, the screams of the man who had dared to touch his family, abruptly cut off as the sound-proofed door sealed shut behind him. The karma was complete. The scales were balanced. Now, he had a queen to return to. Summer bled into a sweltering Chicago autumn. The leaves in the wealthy northern suburbs turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, but Celeste hardly noticed the changing seasons. Her entire world had been irrevocably transformed. She had not returned to the glass and steel corporate tower in River North. Instead, she ruled the financial side of the Gallagher syndicate from the sprawling, fortified estate in Winnetka. The transition had not been easy. Celeste had spent 32 years making herself small, hiding her intellect and her body behind oversized cardigans and a quiet demeanor. Now she was thrust into the blinding spotlight of the underworld. At first, the men in Declan's inner circle hadn't known what to make of her. They were accustomed to mob wives who spent their days at luxury spas and shopping on the Magnificent Mile, women who looked away when the blood money rolled in. Celeste was different. She was a heavy-set, fiercely intelligent forensic accountant who wore flowing maternity dresses and sat at the head of the mahogany dining table, relentlessly auditing the syndicate's ledgers. Any doubts about her fitness for the role were quickly eradicated. 3 weeks after moving into the estate, Celeste had uncovered a massive leak in their Montreal pharmaceutical operation, saving the organization millions and securing the loyalty of every capo in the room. They didn't see a fat woman. They saw a financial genius who protected their livelihoods. They called her the boss's mind. Tommy practically worshipped the ground she walked on, acting as her personal, giant shadow wherever she moved within the estate. But the most profound change was her relationship with Declan. He treated her with a reverence that bordered on religious. He stripped away her insecurities with the same meticulous care he used to dismantle his enemies. Every night, away from the prying eyes of his soldiers, the ruthless syndicate leader would kneel before her in their palatial bedroom, pressing kisses to her swollen belly, murmuring to their unborn son. He worshipped her heavy thighs, her broad hips, and the soft expanse of her stomach. He made her feel beautiful, powerful, and utterly invincible. By the 3rd week of October, Celeste was 39 weeks pregnant and incredibly uncomfortable. She felt like a beached whale, her back aching constantly, her ankles swollen to twice their normal size. It was a Tuesday evening, raining heavily outside. Declan was hosting a sit-down with 2 rival capos from the New York families in the first-floor library. Celeste was upstairs in the master suite, reviewing the quarterly projections on her laptop when the first contraction hit. It wasn't a dull ache. It was a vicious, sharp twisting of her abdomen that stole her breath and caused her to drop her laptop onto the duvet. "Okay," Celeste gasped, clutching her stomach. "Okay, Braxton Hicks. Just breathe." 10 minutes later, the second one hit, harder than the first. At the same time, she felt a sudden warm rush of fluid soak through her silk nightgown. Her water had broken. Celeste reached for the intercom on the nightstand, her hand shaking. She pressed the button for the library. Downstairs, the atmosphere was tense. Declan was staring down the New York capos, his voice cold and commanding as they negotiated the territory lines for the upcoming year. The heavy oak doors of the library were guarded by Tommy and 2 other enforcers. The intercom on the desk buzzed, a sharp, intrusive sound. Declan frowned, his eyes never leaving the rival boss. He pressed the receiver. "Yes?" "Declan," Celeste's voice crackled through the speaker. She sounded out of breath, a tight edge of pain in her tone. I think you need to conclude your meeting. Now." The New York capos bristled at the interruption, but Declan's reaction was instantaneous. The cold, calculating syndicate boss vanished. The blood drained from his face. He slammed his hands down on the desk, standing up so violently his heavy leather chair toppled backward. "The meeting is over," Declan barked, already sprinting toward the door. "Get out of my house!" He didn't wait for their response. He threw open the library doors. "Tommy, call Harrison. Tell him we are on our way to the clinic right now. Get the armored SUV to the front door." Declan took the grand staircase 2 steps at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs in a frantic rhythm of pure, unadulterated terror. He had faced down loaded guns, rival assassins, and federal indictments without flinching. But the sound of Celeste in pain stripped him of every defense. He burst into the master suite to find Celeste standing by the bed, gripping one of the heavy mahogany posts, her face pale and contorted in agony as another contraction ripped through her. "I've got you," Declan said, his voice miraculously steady despite the panic roaring in his ears. He scooped her up into his arms, carrying her easily despite her size and the heavy pregnancy. "I've got you, Moel. You're doing perfectly." The next 10 hours were a blur of screaming, clinical lights and agonizing fear. Dr. Harrison's underground maternity clinic was a fortress of medical technology, but money and power meant nothing in the chaotic face of childbirth. Celeste labored intensely. Her body, soft and heavy, proved to be an absolute powerhouse of resilience. Through it all, Declan never left her side. He held her hand, whispering fierce Gaelic promises into her ear, wiping the sweat from her brow, and anchoring her to reality when the pain threatened to pull her under. Just before dawn, the piercing, furious cry of a newborn shattered the sterile silence of the delivery room. Celeste collapsed back against the pillows, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. She was utterly exhausted, her hair plastered to her skull. but she had never felt more triumphant. "A boy, Doctor," Harrison announced with a warm smile, quickly cleaning the wriggling infant before wrapping him in a warm blanket. "A perfectly healthy, strong baby boy. Congratulations, Mr. Gallagher. Ms. Higgins." Declan stood frozen, his massive chest rising and falling heavily. He looked at the screaming bundle in the doctor's arms, and then looked down at Celeste. The ruthless Mafia boss, the king of Chicago, dropped to his knees beside the birthing bed. He buried his face in the crook of Celeste's neck, and for the first time in his adult life, Declan Gallagher wept. They were tears of absolute relief, of overwhelming love, and of profound gratitude. Dr. Harrison gently placed the baby onto Celeste's chest. The infant immediately quieted at the warmth of his mother's skin, his tiny fists waving in the air before settling against her breast. Celeste looked down at her son. He had a shock of dark hair, and even entirely squished and new, he had Declan's strong jawline. She felt Declan's large hand come up to rest over hers, gently encompassing the tiny body of their child. "Liam," Celeste whispered, looking at Declan. "Liam Gallagher." Declan kissed her forehead, then moved down to press a kiss to the top of his son's head. Liam, the heir to the Empire. 3 months later, the Winter Gala at the Drake Hotel was held once again. This time, Celeste did not hide in the dark archival library. She walked into the grand ballroom on the arm of Declan Gallagher. She wore a custom-made emerald green gown that proudly displayed her full, lush curves and the lingering softness of her postpartum body. The room fell entirely silent as they entered. The elites of the underworld, the politicians, the socialites, everyone stopped to look at the king and his queen. There were no whispers about her size. There was only awe and respect. She was the woman who had saved the boss's life, the mastermind who doubled their profits, and the mother of the next generation. Declan guided her to the center of the room. He didn't care about the music or the staring crowd. He wrapped his arm around her thick waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He looked at her with a burning, possessive pride that made Celeste's breath catch. "You used to be invisible," Declan murmured against her ear, his hand trailing down to rest on the soft curve of her hip. "Look around, Celeste. They can all see you now." Celeste smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. She didn't need to hide anymore. The hard karma of her past had burned away the shadows, leaving her exactly where she was meant to be, ruling an empire, loved fiercely and never, ever invisible again. Did you love the intense twists and the satisfying hard karma in Celeste and Declan's story? Watching the invisible underdog rise to become the absolute queen of a mafia empire proves that true strength comes in all shapes and sizes. If this mafia romance drama kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this story with your friends who love a fierce, protective hero and a brilliant heroine who outsmarts them all. Subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, dramatic, and emotionally charged stories.